Deep in the forests of Northern California, just 5 miles from the Oregon border, sits a place that was designed to break the human spirit. It's not on any tourist map. Most Californians have never heard of it, but inside the concrete walls of this facility, some of the most dangerous men in America live in conditions that the United Nations has called torture. This is Pelican Bay State Prison, and for over 30 years, it has been home to the most violent gang members, serial killers, and inmates that even other maximum security prisons couldn't control. Here, men spend 23 hours a day in windowless concrete cells the size of a parking space. Some haven't felt sunlight on their skin in decades. Some have been driven insane by the isolation. And some have created an empire of violence that reaches from these cells into every corner of California and beyond. This is the story of Pelican Bay, the Supermax prison that changed American incarceration. Forever, this is the story of the gangs who run it from the inside the Mexican Mafia. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Northern Structure. And this is the story of what happens when you try to create a prison so harsh, so isolating, so absolutely controlled that it would eliminate gang violence forever. Spoiler alert. It didn't work. Welcome to Hell on Earth. Welcome to Pelican Bay. To understand Pelican Bay, you have to go back to the 1970s and 80s, a time when California's prison system was completely out of control. The state's prisons were overcrowded, understaffed, and dominated by violent prison gangs. The Mexican Mafia controlled Southern California prisons. The Aryan Brotherhood terrorized white inmates into compliance. The Black Guerrilla Family waged war against guards and rival gangs. Between 1970 and 1985, there were more than 1,100 inmate homicides in California prisons. Guards were being attacked at unprecedented rates. Entire facilities would go on lockdown for weeks at a time because administrators couldn't control the violence. So in 1986, California made a decision. They would build a new kind of prison, a prison specifically designed to isolate the worst of the worst. A prison where gang communication would be impossible, a prison so harsh that even the toughest inmates would fear being sent there. They called it a Supermax, short for Super Maximum Security, and in December 1989, Pelican Bay State Prison opened its doors. The facility cost $217 million to build, one of the most expensive prisons ever constructed at that time. It sits on 275 acres in Crescent City, California, a small logging town with a population of just 7,500 people. This was intentional. The remoteness makes it nearly impossible for gang members' families to visit. The isolation makes escape attempts futile even if you got over the walls. You'd be lost in hundreds of miles of dense forest. Pelican Bay was built to house 2,280 inmates. But its crown jewel, the feature that made it different from every other prison in America, was the SHU. The security housing unit. The SHU. Pronounced SHU. But inmates have a different name for it. They call it the hole. And it was designed to be the most isolating, psychologically devastating prison environment ever created in the United States. Each SHU cell is 80 square feet. For perspective, that's smaller than the average bathroom in an American home. Inmates are locked inside for 23 hours a day. They eat in their cells. They sleep in their cells. They use the toilet in their cells alone. Always alone. For 1 hour each day, inmates are allowed out for exercise. But even this is solitary. They're escorted by the guards to an individual concrete yard, walls on all sides, a mesh covering overhead. No other inmates. No human contact. Just concrete and sky. This is how men live at Pelican Bay's SHU. Not for months. For years. For decades. Some inmates have been in the SHU since the day Pelican Bay opened in 1989. That is over 35 years of solitary confinement. 35 years without touching another human being. 35 years in an 80-square-foot cell. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has stated that solitary confinement beyond 15 DA constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment at Pelican Bay. 15 days is just the beginning. But here's what the architects of Pelican Bay didn't understand. When you put the most violent gang members in isolation and take away everything else, violence becomes currency. Communication becomes power, and the gangs adapt because you can build walls, you can eliminate. Contact. You can take away privileges, but you cannot eliminate the human need for connection, and in that need, the gangs found a way. The major gangs dominate Pelican Bay, and to understand the violence, you need to understand who they are and what they're fighting for first. You need to understand that California's Latino prison gangs are split by geography, north versus south, Nortegos versus Sorayos, and this divide runs deeper than any other prison rivalry in America. It started in the 1960s. The Mexican Mafia formed in Southern California prisons. There were originally inmates from East Los Angeles who banded together for protection. But they quickly evolved into something more, a criminal enterprise that controlled drug trafficking, extortion, and violence throughout Southern California's prison system. The Mexican Mafia's reach extends beyond prison walls. On the streets, thousands of Southern California gangs pay taxes to LAIM. Sorayo gang members identified by the color blue and the number 13 follow orders that originate from Mexican Mafia shot callers in prisons like Pelican Bay. But Northern California Latinos refused to submit to the Mexican Mafia. In 1968, at Soledad Prison, they formed their own gang, Nuestra Familia, our family. The number 14 became their symbol and the 14th letter. Red became their color, and a blood feud began that continues to this day. This isn't just a prison beef. This is a war that has claimed thousands of lives. If you're a Nortego and you enter a Southern California prison, you're marked for death. If you're a Sorayo and you end up in Northern California, same result, and Pelican Bay, located in the far north of the state, became a Nortego stronghold. Nuestra Familia operates like a military organization. The mace of their leadership council makes decisions that affect the entire organization. These men, many of them locked in Pelican Bay's SHU, issue orders that result in murders, drug deals, and extortion on the streets of California. And here's the thing that law enforcement learned the hard way. You can lock these men in solitary confinement, strip them of all privileges, monitor their every move, and they'll still find a way to run their criminal empires. Now let's talk about the Aryan Brotherhood, the most violent prison gang in American history. The Aryan Brotherhood was born in 1964 at San Quentin State Prison. White inmates were a minority and were being preyed upon by black and Latino gangs, so they organized. They adopted Nazi imagery not necessarily because they were all ideological white supremacists, but because those symbols projected violence and intimidation. But what started as protection quickly became something far more sinister. The Aryan Brotherhood adopted a code, blood in, blood out. To join, you had to kill someone, preferably a racial enemy. To leave, you had to die. There was no retirement from the AB by the 1980s. The Aryan Brotherhood had spread to the federal prison system and prisons across America, despite making up less than 0.1% of the prison population, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 members nationwide. They were responsible for 18 to 25% of all prison murders. Let me repeat that. 0.1% of inmates, 1/4 of all prison murders. The FBI has called them the most violent prison gang in America. And when Pelican Bay opened in 1989, the California Department of Corrections sent their most violent Aryan Brotherhood shot callers straight to the SHU. Men like Barry the Baron Mills, Tyler the Hulk Bingham, and dozens of other AB leaders who had orchestrated murders from prison cells for decades. Barry Mills spent over 40 years in solitary confinement, most of it at Pelican Bay. He died in ADX Florence Supermax in 2018. During his time in isolation, he ordered dozens of murders. He ran AB operations across the California prison system, and he did it all from a concrete cell with no windows, no contact, and 23-hour lockdown. How? Because the AB developed sophisticated communication methods that even total isolation couldn't. They used coded letters. They used corrupt prison staff. They used visits from attorneys. They used kites passed through plumbing systems. They adapted. And here's what makes the Aryan Brotherhood particularly dangerous at Pelican Bay. They were allied with the Mexican Mafia against their common enemies Nuestra Familia and black prison gangs. In a place designed to eliminate gang alliances, the Ab and Laim found ways to cooperate, coordinate, and kill, but the Ab aren't the only black gang at Pelican Bay. There's another organization older, more disciplined, and with roots that go back to the radical politics of the 1960s, the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF. Founded in 1966 by George Jackson at San Quentin Prison, unlike other prison gangs that started as protection rackets, BGF began as a revolutionary political organization. Jackson was a Black Panther who envisioned the gang as a vehicle for black liberation both in prison and in society. George Jackson was shot and killed during an alleged escape attempt at San Quentin in 1971, but the Black Guerrilla Family survived him, and over the decades, it evolved from a political organization into something far more complex. At Pelican Bay, BGF members are housed in the SHU alongside AB, Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia shot callers. Their outnumbered black inmates make up only about 28% of California's prison population. But BGF structure, discipline, and willingness to use extreme violence have allowed them to maintain power. Today's BGF exists in a strange duality. Publicly, they maintain revolutionary rhetoric about fighting oppression and reforming the prison system. Privately, they're involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and murder just like every other prison gang. And BGF's influence extends far beyond California. They have a major presence in Maryland prisons, where they've been linked to corruption of correctional officers. In 2013, 44 people, including 13 correctional officers, were indicted in Maryland for conspiracy involving BGF. The gang had essentially infiltrated and controlled parts of the prison system. Think about that. Correctional officers, people trusted with keys, access, and authority working for a prison gang, smuggling drugs, smuggling phones, taking orders from inmates. This is the power these organizations wield. At Pelican Bay, BGF leadership in the SHU coordinates with members in general population and on the streets, despite 23-hour lockdown, despite monitored phone calls, despite mail screening. They find ways to communicate, because here's what prison administrators learned: you can control the environment, but you can't control the human mind. Inmates are creative. They're motivated, and they have nothing but time to develop systems that circumvent security. Drugs enter Pelican Bay through visitors who hide them in body cavities. Cell phones get smuggled in pieces of battery here, a SIM card there, reassembled inside, even in the SHU, where inmates are supposed to have no contact. Contraband finds its way in. This is a micro cell phone, about the size of a cigarette lighter. It can make calls, send texts, and it's worth more than gold inside prison. A phone like this can sell for $5,000 to $10,000 in prison. Why? Because it's untraceable. It gives gang leaders direct communication with the outside world. With a contraband phone, a gang leader in Pelican Bay's SH, you can order a hit in Los Angeles and have it carried out within hours. He can coordinate drug deals. He can threaten witnesses. He can run an entire criminal enterprise from an 80-square-foot cell, and they do. Murders on California streets have been directly traced back to orders from Pelican Bay inmates. The isolation doesn't stop the violence. In some ways, it makes it worse. Now let's talk about what it's actually like to live in Pelican Bay's SHU, because this is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Wake up at 6 a.m. when breakfast is pushed through a slot in your door. Eat it in your cell not alone. Then wait. At some point between 7 a.m. and noon, guards will come get you for your 1 hour of exercise. You'll be handcuffed through the slot in your door, a procedure called cuffing up. The guards will escort you handcuffed to an individual exercise yard. It's a concrete box about 16 by 25 feet. 3 concrete walls, 1 chain-link wall facing a corridor where guards watch, a mesh covering overhead so you can see sky but can't escape. You stand there for an hour. Maybe you pace. Maybe you do push-ups. Maybe you just stand and look at the sky, the only natural light you'll see all day. There's no equipment. No basketball. No weights. Just concrete and sky. Then you're cuffed up again and escorted back to your cell. The door closes, and you wait. Lunch comes through the slot, you eat. Then you wait some more. There's no TV, no radio, no programs, no jobs, no visitors in the SHU, except attorneys and, occasionally, families separated by plexiglass, no phone calls except rare, monitored ones, no human touch. Ever, you use the toilet in your cell, right there. Guards can look through your door slot at. Anytime, there's no privacy, no dignity. Remember, your cell is 80 square feet. You can take for steps from wall to wall. And some men do this for decades. 1 year in SHU. 5 years. 10 years. 20 years. Some Pelican Bay inmates have been in the SHU for over 30 years. 30 years of 80 square feet. 30 years of 23-hour lockdown. 30 years without touching another human being except in handcuffs. And what does this do to the human mind? Psychologists who've studied long-term solitary confinement have documented severe mental deterioration, hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, an inability to tolerate social interaction even when it's offered. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychology professor at UC Santa Cruz, has spent decades studying the effects of solitary confinement at Pelican Bay. What he found is nothing short of torture. In a comprehensive study of Pelican Bay SHU inmates, Dr. Haney found that over 91% of inmates experienced anxiety and nervousness. 84% suffered from chronic depression, 77% had trouble concentrating, 73% experienced social withdrawal so severe they couldn't interact with others even when given the opportunity. But it gets worse. 70% of SHU inmates reported having violent fantasies they never had before isolation. 63% experienced ruminating thoughts they couldn't control. 55% had heart palpitations. 52% suffered chronic dizziness, and in the most severe cases, self-mutilation, suicide attempts. Complete psychotic breaks from reality. Inmates would cut themselves with anything sharp. They'd hang themselves with torn sheets. They'd lose touch with reality entirely, believing the walls were talking to them or that they were being persecuted by invisible forces. Between 1989 and 2011, there were over 70 suicide attempts in Pelican Bay's SHU. In a facility housing around 1,200 SHU inmates at any given time, that's a suicide attempt every few months for over 2 decades. Some inmates deteriorated so completely they could no longer care for themselves. They stopped bathing, stopped eating, stopped speaking. They'd sit in their cells covered in their own waste. Catatonic. Completely broken, these men would be moved to prison psychiatric units still in isolation, but now medicated and under constant watch to prevent suicide. Some would never recover. Some would spend the rest of their lives in this vegetative state, their minds permanently damaged by years in the SHU. Imagine going into the SHU at age 25. You're a gang member. Sure, you've done violent things, but you're mentally coherent. You can hold a conversation. You can remember things. You understand cause and effect. Now imagine 15 years later, you're 40, you've spent over 5,000 consecutive days in an 80-square-foot cell. You've had fewer than 5,500 hours outside that cell in 15 years. You've had almost no meaningful human contact, no touch, no conversation beyond brief exchanges, with guards who see you as a dangerous animal. Now imagine 15 years later, you're 40, you've spent over 5,000 consecutive days in an 80-square-foot cell. You've had fewer than 5,500 hours outside that cell in 15 years. You've had almost no meaningful human contact, no touch, no conversation beyond brief exchanges, with guards who see you as a dangerous animal. Some inmates are so damaged by SHU that when they're released into general population, they can't handle it. They panic, they become violent. They request to go back to the SHU because isolation is all they know anymore. In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, issued a statement calling for a ban on solitary confinement beyond 15 days. He specifically cited Pelican Bay as an example of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment that may constitute torture under international law. 15 days, that's the maximum the UN says is acceptable before permanent psychological harm occurs. At Pelican Bay, inmates have been in the SHU for over 11,000 days. That's more than 700 times the UN limit. But California defended the practice. Prison officials argued that these were the most dangerous inmates in the system, gang leaders, murderers. Men who couldn't be housed safely anywhere else. The SHU, they claimed, was necessary for security. And on the surface, that argument makes sense. These are men who've murdered other inmates. Men who've ordered hits from prison cells. Men who've spent their entire adult lives engaged in organized crime. But here's the question. Does that justify torture? Does that justify treatment that the United Nations says violates basic human rights? And most importantly, does it even work? Because if the SHU was designed to eliminate gang violence, it failed spectacularly. Despite the SHU, despite the isolation, despite every security measure, violence at Pelican Bay continued, because locking gang leaders in solitary doesn't eliminate gangs. It just changes how they operate. Gang leaders in the SHU continued to issue orders through kites, through coded letters, through whispered conversations during brief interactions with other inmates during escort to medical appointments or exercise yards, and inmates found increasingly creative ways to communicate. They'd write messages on tiny pieces of paper the size of a fingernail. They'd memorize complex coded messages. They'd use plumbing systems to pass notes between cells. Here's one method that was discovered during an investigation. Inmates would take apart their toilets, a process that took hours using makeshift tools. They'd place a kite in a waterproof package made from plastic wrap. They'd push it through the plumbing trap to the next cell. The inmate next door would retrieve it. Then both would reassemble their toilets before the next cell inspection. Guards would walk past and see nothing unusual, but orders for murders, drug deals, and attacks had just been transmitted from one maximum security cell to another. Take Hugo Pinnell, a BGF member who spent over 40 years in various forms of solitary confinement, including decades at Pelican Bay's SHU. In 2015, after a landmark settlement allowed some long-term SHU inmates to be released into general population, Pinnell was transferred to California State Prison, Sacramento. He was murdered within hours, stabbed to death in the prison yard by Aryan Brotherhood and Mexican Mafia members who'd been waiting for him to leave the protection of solitary confinement. 40 years in isolation, and the gangs never forgot, never forgave. And here's the disturbing part. Pinnella's murder was planned by gang leaders who were themselves locked in Pelican Bay SHU. From their isolated cells, they communicated with allies in other prisons. They identified who would carry out the hit. They coordinated timing. They made sure Pinnell would die the moment he was vulnerable. This is the power these organizations maintain. Even total isolation doesn't break their networks. It just makes them adapt. And the violence isn't just planned, it's constant. Inmates manufacture weapons from anything available. A piece of metal from a bed frame is sharpened on concrete for hours. A toothbrush is melted down and molded into a spike. A razor blade is embedded in a bar of soap. Prison staff confiscate thousands of weapons at Pelican Bay every year, but for every weapon found, more are manufactured. It's an arms race that never ends, and despite intense scrutiny, gang members find ways to pass contraband during the brief moments when they're near each other. A package changes hands during a millisecond-long pass in a corridor. A kite is dropped in a common area and picked up by another inmate seconds later. Communication and coordination continue because these aren't disorganized criminals. These are sophisticated organizations with structure, discipline, and long-term strategic thinking. The Mexican Mafia operates like a corporation. Nuestra Familia runs like a military unit. The Aryan Brotherhood maintains an ideology that transcends individual members, and the money involved is staggering. Prison gangs control drug distribution throughout California and beyond. They run extortion rackets. They control illegal gambling. They launder money through legitimate businesses operated by associates on the outside. In 2019, a massive investigation called Operation Quiet Riot resulted in the seizure of over $2 million in cash, 200 pounds of methamphetamine, and 10 kilograms of heroin. The operation was controlled by Mexican Mafia members incarcerated at Pelican Bay and other California prisons, and at the center of the investigation, contraband cell phones. Gang leaders were using these phones to coordinate shipments, collect debts, and order enforcement actions, all from inside maximum security cells. Prison staff conduct regular searches, shakedowns, looking for contraband, but in a game of cat and mouse that's been going on for decades. Inmates are often one step ahead. They hide phones inside their bodies, wrapped in balloons or latex, swallowed or inserted rectally. They hide them in walls, digging out chunks of concrete, inserting the phone, and covering the hole with a mixture of toilet paper and dirt that dries to match the wall color. They hide them in toilets, in books, in legal documents that guards are discouraged from searching due to attorney-client privilege. This is an X-ray from a Pelican Bay medical examination. That rectangular object, a cell phone. This inmate had swallowed it and was experiencing internal complications. He needed surgery to remove it, but he was willing to risk death to smuggle that phone into the facility. Despite these seizures, contraband continues to flow. Why? Because the demand is infinite and the rewards are enormous. A cell phone that costs $50 on the outside sells for $5,000 to $10,000 inside. Drugs that cost $100 outside sell for $1,000 inside. The profit margins make the risk worthwhile. July 8, 2013. Something unprecedented happened at Pelican Bay and across California's prison system. Nearly 30. 0 inmates staged a coordinated hunger strike, one of the largest in American prison history. This wasn't random. This was organized. That was led by inmates inside Pelican Bay SSHU, the very men who were supposedly too isolated to communicate with anyone. But here's what made this hunger strike truly extraordinary. It was organized by enemies. Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia, sworn enemies who'd been at war for 45 years. Aryan Brotherhood and black Guerrilla Family gangs that had murdered each other's members for decades all agreed to put aside their conflicts for one purpose: to challenge the conditions in the SHU. The organizers were Todd Ashker of the Aryan Brotherhood, Arturo Castellanos of the Mexican Mafia, Juan Atambujama of the Black Guerrilla Family, and Antonio Gillen of Nuestra Familia. Think about that. The shot callers of California's from major prison gangs, working together, they issued 5 court demands, not demands for release, not demands for luxury. Demands for basic humanity. The second demand was particularly important: abolish the debriefing policy. This was California's catch-22. If you were validated as a gang member based on tattoos, associates, or even reading gang-related materials, you were sent to the SHU indefinitely. The only way out was to debrief, meaning snitch on your fellow gang members. But if you debriefed, you were marked as a snitch. Your own gang would try to kill you. Rival gangs would try to kill you for information you might have about them. So you'd be placed in protective custody, still isolated, just in a different section. You traded one form of permanent isolation for another, and the validation process was a joke. You could be validated as a gang member for having gang tattoos even if you'd gotten them 20 years ago and had left the gang. For receiving a letter from a known gang member even if that member was your brother. For being seen talking to gang members unavoidable in a prison environment. There were men in the SHU who left their gangs decades earlier but couldn't prove it. Men who were validated based on associations that were unavoidable in prison. Men who'd been model inmates for years but remained in isolation because of tattoos they'd gotten in their youth. So, on July 8, 2013, these men stopped eating. And they didn't do it alone. Through kites, through coded messages, through smuggled communications, they'd organized inmates across California's entire prison system at its peak. 30,000 inmates across 24 California prisons were on hunger strike. It was the largest coordinated prisoner action in American history. It was organized by men in solitary confinement who supposedly couldn't communicate with anyone. 1 week passed, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Medical staff began monitoring the strikers for organ failure. Some inmates lost 30, 40, even 50 pounds, but they continued. The state tried to break the strike. They offered compromises that didn't address the core demands. They threatened discipline. They warned of medical consequences. But the inmates held firm outside the prisons. Pressure was building. Family members held vigils. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits. Amnesty International called for California to meet the strikers' demands. International media covered the story. The world was watching on September 5th. 2013, after 60 days the hunger strike ended, the state agreed to review gang validation procedures and reduce the use of long-term solitary confinement. It wasn't everything the inmates demanded, but it was a crack in the system. But more importantly, the hunger strike had proven something. Even in the most extreme isolation, even under conditions designed to eliminate communication, human beings find a way to organize, resist, and fight back. But the real change came through the courts. In 2012, inmates at Pelican Bay filed a lawsuit that would fundamentally challenge the entire concept of indefinite solitary confinement. The case was called Ashker v. Governor of California. The lead plaintiff was Todd Ashker, the Aryan Brotherhood member who'd helped organize the hunger strike, but the case represented thousands of SHU inmates. Their argument was simple but profound. Indefinite solitary confinement with no meaningful review violates the Eighth Amendment as prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Keeping someone in isolation for decades based solely on gang affiliation, with no way to prove they've disassociated, is unconstitutional. The case was assigned to U.S. District Judge Claudia Wilken, and over months of testimony, a damning picture emerged. Expert witnesses, psychologists, neuroscientists, human rights advocates testified about the devastating effects of long-term solitary confinement. They presented brain imaging studies showing physical changes in the brains of isolated inmates. They described a syndrome called SHU syndrome, a constellation of symptoms unique to long-term isolation. The symptoms: hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions and hallucinations, panic attacks, difficulties with thinking, concentration, and memory, intrusive obsessional thoughts, paranoia, and increased risk of violence upon release. Permanent emotional damage. Former SHU inmates testified about trying to return to normal life after years in isolation. One man described having a panic attack in a grocery store because the lights were too bright and there were too many people. Another described being unable to maintain relationships because he'd forgotten how to read social cues or have normal conversations. And the state's own data showed that inmates released from the SHU had higher recidivism rates than those released from general population. The isolation wasn't rehabilitating anyone. It was making them more dangerous, more damaged, more likely to fail upon release. California's Department of Corrections tried to defend the policy. They argued that SHU inmates were too dangerous for general population, that gang violence would explode without the SHU, that the isolation was necessary for institutional security. But when pressed, they couldn't provide evidence that the SHU actually worked. Violence continued at Pelican Bay. Despite the SHU, gang coordination continued, drug trafficking continued. The SHU hadn't eliminated gangs, it had just tortured people without achieving its stated goal. On September 1st, 2015, after 3 years of litigation, California settled the case. The settlement was groundbreaking. California agreed to move away from indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang affiliation. They agreed to create a step-down program away for inmates to earn their way out of the SHU through good behavior and participation in programs. These are radical changes to California's prison system. Most importantly, the state agreed to review every inmate who'd been in the SHU for more than 10 years. Those who hadn't committed recent violent acts would be moved to step-down programs or general population. Between late 2015 and early 2016, hundreds of inmates were released from Pelican Bay's SHU. Men who'd been in solitary for decades walked out of their cells. Todd Ashker, the lead plaintiff, was released from the SHU after 28 years. 28 years in an 80-square-foot cell. He described the first time he shook someone's hand in nearly 3 decades. The first time he sat at a table with other people. The first time he had a conversation that wasn't through a steel door. Some adapted, some couldn't. Some requested to return to the SHU because isolation was all they knew. But for many, it was a second chance at humanity. But the SHU didn't close. It's still there. Smaller, yes, fewer inmates housed indefinitely. Yes, but Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit still operates, and men are still being sent there. So what does Pelican Bay look like today? Has it changed? Did the reforms work, or did the gangs simply adapt once again? As of 2024, Pelican Bay houses approximately 2,200 inmates. The SHU population has dropped dramatically from over 1,400 in 2011 to around 400 today. The average stay in the SHU has decreased from indefinite to roughly 5 to 8 years. Still long, still damaging, but not the decades-long sentences that were common before. The step-down program created by the settlement has helped transition hundreds of inmates out of total isolation. These units provide a middle ground, more privileges than the SHU, more human contact, but still highly controlled and secure. Inmates in step-down can participate in education programs, vocational training, and group therapy. They can earn their way back to general population through positive behavior. It's not perfect. Some psychologists argue that after years in total isolation, these programs come too late to undo the damage, but it's progress. And here's something remarkable. The predicted explosion of violence didn't happen when hundreds of long-term SHU inmates were released to general population. Corrections officials braced for chaos. Gang leaders back among the general population? Surely there would be massacres, but it didn't happen. In fact, violence rates at Pelican Bay decreased after the reforms. Inmates who'd been in the SHU for decades returned to general population and, largely, didn't become the monsters the state predicted. Many just wanted to do their time in peace. A veteran correctional officer put it this way: a lot of these guys, they just wanted to be treated like human beings. Give them that. And most of them behave. Lock them in a box for 20 years. And yeah, they're going to be animals when they come out. But let's be clear, Pelican Bay is still Pelican Bay. It's still a level for maximum security prison housing California's most violent inmates. Gang activity continues, violence still happens. And the SHU still exists for those deemed dangerous for any other placement. In 2022, there were 47 serious violent incidents at Pelican Bay: assaults, stabbings, attempted murders. In 2023, that number rose to 53. Violence continues because the fundamental reality hasn't changed. This is a prison full of gang members, many serving life sentences with nothing to lose. And the gangs? They're still here, still organized, still running criminal enterprises from inside these walls. A 2024 California Department of Justice report on prison gangs noted that while the Ashka settlement reduced indefinite isolation, it did not eliminate gang power structures. Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family all maintain active leadership at Pelican Bay. In 2023, a murder in Oakland was directly traced to orders from a Nuestra Familia leader at Pelican Bay. Despite the reforms, despite the reduced SHU population, despite increased monitoring, gang leaders still find ways to coordinate violence on the outside. But there's another side to Pelican Bay that rarely gets discussed: the families. Crescent City is 5 hours north of San Francisco, 7 hours from Los Angeles. For families of inmates, many of whom are poor, visiting means taking time off work, paying for gas or bus tickets, sometimes staying overnight in cheap motels. Some families make this trip every month, every single month for years, driving 10 hours each way for a 2-hour visit behind plexiglass because that inmate, gang member or not, murderer or not, is still their son, their brother, their father, and these inmates have children growing up without them. Studies show that children of incarcerated parents have higher rates of poverty, behavioral problems, and involvement in the criminal justice system themselves. The cycle continues. Children of incarcerated parents are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated themselves. The trauma, the poverty, the stigma it creates a pipeline from one generation to the next. Pelican Bay doesn't just house 2,200 inmates. It affects thousands of family members on the outside. But zoom out for a moment. Pelican Bay is just one prison in California's massive correctional system, 33 state prisons, over 95,000 inmates, an annual budget of $15.8 billion, more than the budget of many small countries. In 1980, California had 24,000 people in prison. By 2006, that number had exploded to 173,000, a 621% increase. This was the era of tough-on-crime policies, mandatory minimums, three-strikes laws, and gang enhancements that turned minor offenses into life sentences politicians campaigned on, being tougher on crime than their opponents. 3 strikes and you're out. Life sentences for third felony convictions, even if that third felony was stealing pizza or shoplifting. Gang enhancements that added decades to sentences. Mandatory minimums that stripped judges of discretion, and Pelican Bay was built to house the worst of the worst from this exploding prison population. But worst of the worst became a category that expanded beyond reason. Gang tattoos, shoo. Possessing gang literature, shoo. Associating with known gang members, which is virtually unavoidable in prison. Shoo, the gang validation process became a tool for managing problem inmates, those who filed grievances, those who were too vocal, those who simply annoyed staff. Get validated, get sent to the shoo, and once you're there, good luck getting out. Today, California's prison population has decreased to about 95,000, a dramatic reduction. Criminal Justice Reform's Proposition 47, Proposition 57, realignment have helped. But we're still far above where we were in 1980, and far above international norms. The United States has 4% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's incarcerated people. We imprison people at rates higher than authoritarian regimes, and California, despite recent reforms, still incarcerates at rates far above any Western European democracy. It costs California $106, $0 per year, to house an inmate at Pelican Bay. That's more than it costs to attend Harvard. More than double what it costs to attend UC Berkeley. Imagine if we invested that money in education, mental health treatment, job training, addiction services. How many crimes would be prevented? Because most inmates at Pelican Bay didn't start as hardened gang members. They started as kids. In poverty, kids in communities devastated by the war on drugs. Kids with no jobs, no opportunities, no hope. They joined gangs because gangs offered belonging, protection, identity. What if we'd intervened at age 13 instead of arresting them at age 17? What if we'd provided mental health treatment instead of incarceration? What if we'd invested in their communities instead of policing them like war zones? There are programs that work, mentoring programs that give at-risk youth positive role models, job training that provides alternatives to gang membership, trauma therapy that addresses the root causes of violent behavior. But instead, we spend over $100,000 per year to lock someone in a cage, provide minimal programming, offer little to no rehabilitation, then release them damaged, traumatized, and unemployable back into the same communities with the same problems, and we act surprised when they reoffend. Imagine being released from Pelican Bay after 20 years. The world has completely changed. Smartphones didn't exist when you went in. Social media didn't exist. The economy is different. Your friends are gone dead, in prison, or moved away. Your family barely recognizes you. You have no job skills. You've been in prison since your early 20s. You have no money. You leave with maybe $200 gate money. You have a criminal record that disqualifies you from most jobs, and you have the psychological scars of decades in isolation. What do? The system is designed to fail, and when someone released from Pelican Bay reoffends, and statistics say most will, we shake our heads and say, see? They're criminals. They belong in cages. We never ask, what role did we play in creating this cycle? So let me bring this back to the human level, because it's easy to talk about gangs, statistics, policies. It's harder to remember that every inmate at Pelican Bay is a person. They're sons whose mothers cry themselves to sleep, fathers whose children are growing up. Without them, brothers whose siblings remember who they were before prison changed them. People who made terrible, violent choices, but people nonetheless. I spoke with a mother whose son has been at Pelican Bay for 15 years. She showed me photos of him as a child. He was a good kid. She said, single quote, smart, not funny. But he got involved with the wrong people. Made bad choices. Hurt someone. And now. She trailed off, staring at a photo of her son behind plexiglass, aged beyond his years. Her son acknowledges what he did. I hurt people. I deserve to be punished. But this, he gestured at the concrete cell visible behind him in the video call. This doesn't make me better. It just makes me more angry. More damaged. When I get out, if I get out, I don't know if I'll even know how to be normal. Anymore. But here's what gives me hope. Some people do make it. Some inmates leave Pelican Bay and build meaningful lives. They become advocates for prison reform. They work with at-risk youth. Trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes, they rebuild relationships with their families. I met a man who spent 18 years at Pelican Bay, 12 of them in the SHU. Today, he works with gang intervention programs in Los Angeles. He goes into schools and tells his story, shows kids his scars, physical and psychological, and sometimes, just sometimes, a kid listens, a kid changes course, a life is saved, he told me. Pelican Bay almost destroyed me, but it didn't, and now I'm going to make sure my time there meant something. If I can stop one kid from going down that path, then maybe it wasn't all wasted. But for every success story, there are dozens who don't make it, who return to prison within months of release, who die on the streets, killed by the same gang violence they participated in, who never recover from the psychological damage of years in isolation. So what have we learned about Pelican Bay? What does this place tell us about ourselves? Pelican Bay was built with the best intentions, or at least, that's what we told ourselves. It was supposed to be the solution to gang violence in California prisons. Total isolation, total control. Break the gangs by breaking their ability to communicate, organize, and coordinate. But what actually happened? We created a torture chamber. We took human beings, violent human beings, yes, but human beings nonetheless, and subjected them to conditions that the United Nations calls torture. We kept them in isolation for decades. We drove some of them insane. And the gang violence? It continued. The gangs adapted. They found ways to communicate through kites, through coded letters, through corrupt staff, through contraband phones. They coordinated from cells where they couldn't see or touch another human being, in some ways. The isolation made them more powerful, turned them into martyrs, elevated their status, gave them mystique. The 2015 settlement was a step forward. Hundreds of men were released from indefinite isolation. The debriefing policy was reformed. A step-down program was created. These are real improvements that have reduced suffering. But the SHU still exists. 100 men are still locked in 80-square-foot cells for 23 hours a day. Some will be there for years. And the conditions, while slightly improved, remain what the UN calls cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. But the SHU still exists. 100 men are still locked in 80-square-foot cells for 23 hours a day. Some will be there for years, and the conditions, while slightly improved, remain what the UN calls cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And it's not just the inmates who suffer. Correctional officers at Pelican Bay have some of the highest rates of PTSD, depression, and substance abuse in the profession. Working in an environment of constant tension, violence, and human misery damages everyone, guards included. So where do we go from here? Because that's the question, isn't it? Do we continue down this path, mass incarceration, Supermax prisons, isolation as punishment? Or do we try something different? Other countries have tried different approaches. Norway's prisons focus on rehabilitation, not punishment. Inmates live in conditions that would seem luxurious compared to Pelican Bay. Private rooms, education, vocational training, restorative justice programs. And it works. Norway has a recidivism rate of 20% compared to California's 67%. Their crime rates are lower. Their society is safer. They spend less money. And they don't torture people in the process. But Americans don't want to hear that. We want punishment. We want revenge. We want criminals to suffer because they made victims suffer. And when someone suggests treating inmates humanely, we recoil. What about the victims? We ask. Why should criminals get education, training, decent conditions when their victims got none of that? I spoke with a crime victim whose attacker is serving time at Pelican Bay. She said something that stuck with me. His suffering doesn't undo mine. And when he gets out, I don't want him to be more dangerous than when he went in. I want him to be better. Not for his sake, for everyone else's. Prevention is the answer. Investing in communities before crime happens, mental health treatment, education, economic. Opportunity, addiction services. These aren't soft-on-crime policies. They ray effective crime prevention that costs a fraction of what we spend on incarceration. But prevention doesn't satisfy our desire for punishment. It doesn't make for good political sound bites. It requires us to invest in communities we'd rather ignore, in people we'd rather write off as thugs and criminals. Tonight, 2,200 men will sleep at Pelican Bay. Some are murderers. Some are gang leaders who've ordered dozens of killings. Some are monsters who've committed unspeakable acts. I'm not here to defend their crimes, but I am here to ask, what are we accomplishing? Are we making society safer? Are we rehabilitating anyone? Are we preventing future crime? Or are we just inflicting suffering because suffering makes us feel like justice is being done? Because here's the truth, Pelican Bay doesn't heal victims. It doesn't make communities safer. It doesn't prevent crime. It just inflicts more suffering on top of the suffering that already exists. And the gangs, they're still here, still organized, still recruiting. Pelican Bay hasn't broken them. It has just given them a shared enemy and turned their leaders into legendary figures who survived. Decades of isolation without breaking, we've built a system that takes troubled young people and turns them into hardened criminals. That takes gang members and turns them into gang legends. That takes people who could maybe, possibly, be redeemed and destroys them so thoroughly that redemption becomes impossible. The 2015 settlement was progress, but it's not enough. Not nearly enough, as long as we're locking human beings in isolation for years. As long as we're spending $100,000 per inmate per year without rehabilitating anyone. As long as we're releasing damaged people back into society and expecting them not to reoffend, we're failing. There are people fighting for change, activists, lawyers, formerly incarcerated advocates, even some correctional officers who've seen firsthand that this system doesn't work. They're pushing for alternatives to incarceration, for restorative justice, for treatment instead of punishment. But change is slow, because we're fighting against decades of tough-on-crime politics, against a for-profit prison. Industry that profits from keeping people locked up, against a culture that believes punishment equals justice, against our own worst instincts for revenge. But change is slow, because we're fighting against decades of tough-on-crime politics, against a for-profit prison industry that profits from keeping people locked up, against a culture that believes punishment equals justice, against our own worst instincts for revenge. Do we want to be a society that believes in redemption, that invests in prevention, that treats even the worst among us with basic human dignity, not because they deserve it, but because we are better than our worst instincts? Or do we want to continue down this path, building more prisons, locking up more people, spending billions on punishment while our schools crumble, while poverty persists, while the root causes of crime go unaddressed? Because Pelican Bay is a choice. We chose to build it. We chose to fill it. We chose to torture people there. And we can choose differently. The men at Pelican Bay made choices that hurt people. Violent choices, destructive choices, choices that deserve consequences. But we made choices too. We chose isolation. We chose suffering. We chose to give up on redemption. And every night, for 100 men in Pelican Bay you lie on concrete bunks in 80-square-foot cells and stare at concrete walls. Some have been doing this for 5 years, some for 10, some for longer. They'll do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The question isn't whether these men deserve punishment. The question is, what does this punishment accomplish? Who does it protect? Who does it rehabilitate? And what does it say about us? Pelican Bay was supposed to be the solution. A place so harsh that it would break gang power forever. But the gangs are still there. The violence is still there. And we've added thousands of psychologically destroyed human beings to the equation. Damaged people will eventually release back into society. This is Pelican Bay State Prison. This is where we send the people we've given up on. This is where we torture in the name of security. This is where billions of dollars and thousands of lives disappear into concrete and steel. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this really the best we can do? This is Pelican Bay. This is us, and until we change this, we're all responsible for what happens behind those walls. If you or someone you know is incarcerated and experiencing psychological distress, resources are available through the Prison Law Office and the ACLU National Prison Project. For families of incarcerated individuals, www.prisonerswithchildren.org. Subscribe for more. Documentaries exposing the realities of America's criminal justice system. Share this documentary if you believe change is possible.